I still remember the smell before anything else, that mixture of burnt oil, sweat, and fear that filled every inch of a B-17 once the engines came alive. It was a smell that stayed in your clothes, in your hair, in the back of your throat for days. You could wash a dozen times and still feel it on your skin, like the war had soaked into you and refused to let go. The engines roared in perfect rhythm, that deep metallic thunder that made your ribs vibrate. It was January of 1943, somewhere over the Pacific, and command said we were going after a Japanese convoy moving south. They told us they were sitting ducks, slow and heavy with supplies, an easy target for a squadron of flying fortresses. Easy target. Those words never sat right with me. Nothing in that ocean was easy. Every mile out there belonged to death. We flew in tight formation. 9 fortresses, each one a world of its own, filled with 10 men trying not to think about the odds. The sunlight poured through the cockpit, sharp and unforgiving, reflecting off the sea below like molten glass. From my gunner's seat, I could see the glint of the water stretching forever, calm and cruel, hiding what waited beneath. The intercom buzzed with small talk, jokes, old baseball scores, nonsense. Anything to keep the silence from swallowing us whole. I remember how young we all were, most of us barely out of high school, but trying hard to sound like veterans. We talked like men who'd already seen everything. But the truth was, most of us were scared kids who just didn't know how to show it. The sky was a clear blue, almost peaceful, until the first voice came through. Bandits. 2 o'clock high. The words froze the air inside the plane. You could feel every heart skip at once. The Zeros came in fast, black dots against the sun, their engines whining like angry hornets. They were graceful, almost beautiful in the way they moved, curving and diving with impossible precision. For a moment, I just watched, struck by the terrible beauty of it, and then instinct took over. I grabbed the handles of my .50 caliber, my fingers trembling, but steadying as the tracers began to arc through the air. The sky exploded into motion, bursts of fire, twisting metal, voices shouting over each other through static. The plane to our left took a hit in the wing. Flames crawled across it like living things. I saw a figure leap, just a dark shape tumbling toward the sea, and then the fortress went down, spinning, burning, gone. You don't forget that sight. You see it every time you close your eyes, even decades later. The smell of cordite filled the cabin, sharp and choking. My bullets tore through the air, some finding their mark, some vanishing into the void. 1 Zero burst into flame right in front of me, its pieces scattering like sparks before disappearing into the ocean. I felt a rush. Not joy, not pride, just raw survival. The pilot's voice came through, calm but tight. Number 3 engines gone. Hold steady. The plane shuddered, groaning like it might tear apart. Sweat dripped into my eyes, stinging, and I wiped it with a sleeve already blackened with grease. Another fortress went down behind us. The explosion so bright, it turned the inside of our plane gold for an instant. I didn't want to look back. You never looked back. You just kept shooting, kept breathing, because stopping meant thinking, and thinking meant breaking. The ocean below looked so still, so peaceful, that it made everything feel unreal, as if none of it was happening, as if we were ghosts watching our own deaths from above. We kept climbing, pushing forward, battered, but not broken, until the radio crackled with the words we'd been waiting for. Target in sight. When I leaned toward the open bay and looked down, my stomach clenched. The fleet stretched out beneath us. Dozens of ships, destroyers, transports, all moving in tight formation, their wakes white scars across the water. For a heartbeat, it was quiet again. Even the gunners stopped firing. We were 9 fortresses against an empire's pride, and somehow, that felt right. The order came. The bomb bay doors opened, and the sound that followed was like the ocean exhaling. One by one, the payloads fell, small dark shapes tumbling toward the ships. The world held its breath. Then the sea erupted. Flames leapt from the decks. Smoke rose in thick black pillars, and the sky itself seemed to darken. The Japanese fleet wasn't an easy target anymore. They were just as mortal as we were. I watched one of their destroyers split in half, fire and steel twisting together like a dying beast. The explosions rolled up through the air, shaking our fortress so hard it felt like the bones of the earth were breaking. Down below, men were jumping into the sea, some on fire, some just trying to swim away from the burning wreckage. It was the kind of sight that makes you feel both invincible and hollow at the same time. We'd done our job, maybe too well. As we turned back toward base, smoke rising behind us like a storm, I remember thinking that the world below was never going to be the same again. Neither were we. Tell me, where are you watching this from right now? Drop it in the comments below. When we got back to base that night, the silence felt heavier than the roar of the engines. No one said much as we climbed out of the fortress. The metal skin was pocked with bullet holes, blackened in places where shrapnel had kissed it. One engine was barely hanging on, coughing smoke like an old man on his last breath. But she had brought us home, and for that, I gave her a pat before stepping down onto the dirt. The airfield lights glowed faintly through the mist, and the ground crew ran toward us with stretchers, toolboxes, and cigarettes. I remember one mechanic, a kid from Kansas, staring at the holes in the fuselage and just whispering, "Jesus." He didn't have to say more. We were missing 3 birds from the formation. 30 men. You don't talk about numbers like that, you feel them. Every face at the mess tent that night had an empty seat beside it, and nobody had an appetite. The stew tasted like ash. The coffee was bitter and cold. Someone tried to laugh, some stupid joke about how the Japanese had good aim, but it died before it left his mouth. After the briefing, the colonel told us the photos from reconnaissance showed half the convoy destroyed. A major success. The words felt strange in my ears. Success. I thought of the destroyer splitting in 2, the men leaping into the water, the sea burning. Maybe he was right. Maybe that was success. But it didn't feel like it. We were alive, and that was supposed to be victory enough. But I couldn't shake the feeling that we'd left a part of ourselves somewhere over that smoking ocean. When I lay down that night, the cot beneath me felt too soft, too safe. My hands still twitched like they were holding the gun grip, and my ears rang with phantom engine noise. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the fortress behind us breaking apart, wings twisting, the fireball blooming against the sky. I told myself they went quick. We all did. It's a lie you learn early, the kind you need to keep going. Morning came with the same heat and the same orders. Rearm, refuel. You're flying again in 48 hours. No time to breathe. That was how they kept us from thinking too much. Just enough time to patch the holes and load more bombs. I sat with a cigarette between my fingers, watching the crew work. The plane looked like a wounded animal being stitched together for another fight it didn't ask for. One of the gunners, Pete, sat beside me. He was always smiling, even after missions that left everyone else hollow. He said, "We're still here, Joe. That's what counts." I nodded, but my chest felt heavy. Pete didn't make it to the end of the war. None of us knew it then, but maybe part of me did. You get this sense, this quiet knowing, when someone's carrying a flame that's burning too bright. 2 days later, we were up again. Different target this time. The same ocean, the same sky. I watched the ground disappear beneath us and thought about home. My mother used to send letters filled with small things, the smell of her kitchen, the neighbor's dog, the sound of the rain hitting the tin roof back in Ohio. I kept them folded in my flight jacket, creased and yellowed, like small pieces of the world before the war. Reading them between missions was the only way I remembered I was human. Most of the men had their own talisman, a photo, a lucky coin, a scrap of a flag. It didn't matter what it was, as long as it reminded you there was something waiting beyond the clouds and the gunfire. That day, we didn't see enemy fighters until the run was nearly over. The Japanese were learning. They waited now, patient, letting us think we had the upper hand before striking. When the first shells came up from the ships, the sky turned to chaos again. Anti-aircraft fire erupted like fireworks, black puffs surrounding us, shaking the plane with each near miss. I heard the bombardier yelling coordinates, the pilot grunting through the turbulence, and then the words, "Bombs away." The release was almost peaceful. For a moment, the world slowed, the noise faded, and the ocean below seemed still. Then the explosions began, one after another, rolling through the air. The ship we hit must have been carrying ammunition. The blast rose so high it touched the clouds, a giant pillar of flame and smoke curling into the heavens. Even from up there, you could feel the heat. We lost another plane that day. We didn't even see it happen, just caught the trail of smoke and knew. That's how it always went. You never saw the moment they were gone. They just stopped answering the radio, and the formation had a hole where a friend used to be. When we landed, the colonel congratulated us again. "You boys are writing history," he said. Maybe we were. But history, as I learned, doesn't tell you about the smell of burning fuel or the screams you can't unhear. It doesn't tell you how quiet the barracks get at night when someone's bunk stays empty. That evening, I stood by the edge of the runway, watching the sun bleed into the horizon, the sky painted with the same red that had followed us all day. The world looked peaceful, that cruel kind of peace that only comes after killing. I thought of the men we lost, of the faces I'd memorized without meaning to, and I felt something twist inside me. Pride, guilt, exhaustion, they all blend together, until you can't tell one from the other. That's war. It breaks you and makes you at the same time. And still, I knew I'd climb back into that fortress the next time they called, because if I didn't, someone else would have to, and maybe they wouldn't come back either. If you've ever had to keep going even when you were empty inside, if you've ever looked around and realized survival was the only victory left, hit that subscribe button. There's more to this story, and I want you with me when we get there. The ocean always looked calm from 10,000 feet up. You'd look down and think it was gentle, endless, blue, like some vast sleeping thing. But that was a lie too. Everything about war was built on lies like that. The Pacific wasn't calm. It was full of death, waiting. It swallowed ships, men, aircraft, memories. It was patient. That morning, before the sun rose, we stood by the plane with our coffee cups steaming and our nerves burning. Nobody talked much. You could tell by the silence that we all felt it, that something bad was waiting for us. The air smelled like metal and fuel, the same scent that always hung around before a long flight. The crew moved in slow rhythm, each man lost in his own thoughts, checking the guns, running hands along the fuselage like it was some kind of ritual for luck. I had a photograph of my brother tucked inside my jacket, taken before the war, before either of us knew what courage or loss really meant. He was fighting in Europe now, somewhere cold, and every time I looked at his face, I wondered if we'd ever sit on the same porch again, if Mom would ever see both her sons come home. The engines started one by one, coughing smoke, then finding their voice. That sound still lives in my bones, the vibration crawling through your chest, through the floor, through your heart. The fortress was alive now, trembling with power, and for a moment it felt like we were too. We lifted off into a grey dawn, a long string of metal giants rising out of the jungle airfield, climbing toward the line where the sky turned from smoke to blue. The sun broke through the clouds, like fire on the wings. For a few minutes, everything was almost beautiful. Then the radio crackled. Enemy radars got you. Expect contact in 10. The first wave of zeros came out of the sun, just like before. There was no time to think. The sky went from calm to chaos in seconds. Tracers whipped past the windows, the air filled with the sound of bullets striking metal, a sound halfway between rain and thunder. The gunner behind me shouted, then his voice cut off. I turned and saw blood on the floor, a dark pool spreading beneath his boots. I wanted to move, to help him, but there was no time. Another burst hit the tail, sparks exploding, smoke pouring in. The pilot's voice came through loud and raw. Hold formation, keep your damn positions. His hands never left the controls, even when the plane lurched sideways. One wing trailing smoke. I remember the moment everything slowed. The sky was full of burning planes, twisting in every direction, falling like broken birds. I could see one fortress from our squadron below us, its tail gone, still trying to climb, as if the pilot thought he could somehow outrun gravity. He couldn't. The plane flipped and went nose first into the ocean. No parachutes, just a flash of orange, then nothing. The ocean closed, like it was swallowing a secret. I kept firing until the barrel smoked, and the smell of gunpowder made me sick. I saw a zero explode in front of us, the pieces spinning by like knives, and I caught a glimpse of the pilot's face for just a second before he vanished into flame. He couldn't have been older than 20. Our radio was gone, the intercom fried, and half the gauges were shattered. The plane shook so hard it felt like the wings might tear off. Pete, sitting at the waist gun, yelled over the noise. She'll hold. She always holds. And somehow, I believed him. The fortress took hits that would have torn any other plane apart, but she kept flying, bleeding smoke and oil and fire, but flying. We were halfway to the target when the navigator shouted that we were off course. The compass was useless, the clouds thick, no landmarks in sight. The pilot made a choice, keep going blind or turn back. He didn't say which. He just adjusted the heading and kept climbing. I don't know if that was courage or madness, maybe both. When we finally broke through the clouds, the sight below us froze every thought in my head. A Japanese carrier group, not just transports this time, but warships, cruisers, destroyers, the heart of their fleet. They hadn't expected us. The decks were full of aircraft, some already trying to launch, others caught like insects in a web of smoke. The bombardier shouted coordinates, and the pilot lined her up straight through the fire. I held my breath. You could feel the entire plane go silent, every man locked in the same thought. Make this count. The bomb bay doors opened, and the world tilted beneath us. The first explosions hit like hammers from the gods. One carrier erupted in a bloom of white and orange, its deck splintering, planes flipping into the air like toys. Another bomb struck near a destroyer, lifting it clear out of the water. The sky turned black with smoke, the sea boiling with fire and wreckage. The Zeros came at us again, desperate, furious, and we tore into them with everything we had left. The noise was beyond sound now. It was vibration, heat, fury. I watched Pete take one down, then another, until his gun jammed. He swore, tried to fix it, and that's when the shell hit. The explosion threw me off balance, the light blinding. When my vision cleared, Pete was gone, just gone. His gun still smoking, his helmet rolling across the floor. I screamed his name, but the wind stole the sound. We kept flying. We had to. The bombs were gone, the targets burning, and the fortress was barely holding together. The pilot's face was streaked with blood, his knuckles white on the controls. "We're going home," he said, voice calm, almost gentle. The engines coughed, the plane shaking like it was dying, but she kept pushing, mile after mile, over that endless, hateful ocean. I sat by the window, watching the fire fade into the horizon, smoke curling into the sky like ghosts rising to heaven. I thought of Pete, of the others, of how small we really were, no matter how many bombs we dropped. When we finally saw the coast again, it was like seeing the face of an old friend you thought was gone forever. The landing gear barely held, the wheels touched down hard, and when we stopped, none of us moved for a long time. We just sat there, in the silence, breathing, shaking, alive. The fortress had holes big enough to crawl through, and yet she'd brought us home again. Later that night, I found myself staring at the empty bunk where Pete should have been. His lucky coin was still sitting on the table. I picked it up and put it in my pocket. I still have it. It reminds me that sometimes survival isn't victory. It's just the chance to carry someone else's story a little farther. Have you ever lost someone who kept you going through the worst of it? Comment below. Copy and paste this if you have. I still carry their memory with me. The days after that mission blurred together like a fever dream. You'd wake up soaked in sweat, your hands trembling, your ears still ringing from the last time you fired your gun. The world outside the barracks was quiet, almost too quiet, as if the island itself was holding its breath. The airfield smelled of gasoline and rot, of burnt rubber and wet grass. The mechanics moved like ghosts among the wounded fortresses, patching the bullet holes, replacing the engines, wiping blood from the floors before the next crew stepped in. You could hear the hammering all night, the clanging of tools against metal, the sound of war being rebuilt one bolt at a time. I sat outside the hangar most nights, smoking until the dawn, staring at the jungle, and pretending not to see the faces of the ones we lost. The chaplain tried to talk to us, offering quiet words about peace, about purpose, about God's plan, but I couldn't listen. God didn't live in the skies we flew through. I'd seen too much fire to believe in heaven anymore. One afternoon, the colonel called us together. His voice was hard, clipped, carrying that tone of forced confidence men use when they're trying to keep others from breaking. He told us the brass had seen the reports, that our last run had crippled part of the Japanese fleet. "They'll remember that one," he said. "You made history out there." But none of us looked proud. Pete's name was still on the roster, crossed out in red pencil. We all stared at it like a wound that wouldn't close. The colonel must have seen it too, because he stopped talking after that. He just nodded once, turned, and left us there in the dust and silence. The ocean wind came rolling in from the east, carrying the smell of salt and smoke, and for a long time, no one moved. The next mission was supposed to be routine, a reconnaissance flight over the area where we'd hit the carriers. But by then, we knew there was no such thing as routine. Every time you climbed into that fortress, it felt like a coin toss with the devil. I was quieter than usual that morning. The crew noticed. "You all right, Joe?" the bombardier asked. I nodded, but the truth was, I wasn't sure. I'd started dreaming about the sea, about the faces of the men who went down in it. Sometimes I'd wake up gasping, certain I was sinking. Still, when the engines started and the ground fell away beneath us, something in me settled. Up there, amid the noise and the vibration, there was no past or future, just the moment, just the machine. The sky was clear for the first hour. The radio chatter was calm, almost relaxed. Then, without warning, a voice crackled through the static. A distress call from another fortress, code we all recognized. They were under attack, 10 miles ahead. The pilot didn't hesitate. "We're going to them," he said, turning the plane toward the signal. It was suicide, but none of us argued. That was what it meant to fly in those days. You went where the fire was, no matter how much you'd already burned. We reached them just as the fight began. Zeros circled like sharks, their wings flashing in the sun. The damaged fortress below us was trailing smoke. 2 engines dead, but still firing back. I swung the turret around and opened up. The recoil slammed into my shoulders, brass casings flying past my boots, the barrels glowing red, the air filled with tracers, the sky alive with light and death. 1-0 broke formation, coming straight for us. I could see the pilot's eyes through the glass, calm, focused, determined. I fired until the gun jammed, cursing, yanking the lever, my fingers bleeding from the heat. He kept coming. The impact never came. At the last moment, another fortress cut across our path, its guns blazing. The Zero exploded in mid-air, a flash of orange and silver, but the other plane took the blast full on. Its right wing tore away, spinning off like a leaf. I watched it fall, helpless, the crew's voices still on the radio, fading into static. That sound, men screaming through a broken transmitter, that's what stays with you. Not the explosions, not the victory cheers, just that empty, dying noise. We made it back again, somehow, barely. The pilot landed with 2 engines coughing smoke, half the controls dead, the landing gear stuck. The fortress slid across the runway, sparks flying, and came to a stop just short of the tree line. When the engines finally quit, the silence hit like a punch. I climbed out, legs shaking, the sun blinding. The medics were already running, shouting names, counting heads. We'd lost 3 more fortresses in that engagement. Every mission took a little more out of us, piece by piece. That night, I couldn't sleep. I walked down to the edge of the airstrip and watched the waves breaking in the dark. The stars were bright, cruelly bright, scattered across the sky like shards of glass. Somewhere out there, past that horizon, the men we lost were resting beneath the same stars. I tried to talk to them, not out loud, just in my head. I told Pete I was sorry, told the others I'd keep flying for them. Maybe that's how we all survived, by pretending we were doing it for the ones who didn't. Because if we admitted we were just doing it to stay alive, it might have broken something we couldn't fix. When the next dawn came, the call for briefing echoed through the camp again. Same ritual, same fear, same hope that maybe today would be different. It never was. But still, I stood up, grabbed my helmet, and walked toward the plane. Because once you've seen the worst, you stop flying for victory. You fly because someone has to bring the story home. Now tell me something. When was the last time you felt like you were fighting just to keep going? Comment below and tell me. I keep going, no matter what. By then, the war had carved itself into us like shrapnel under the skin. It didn't matter if you were 20 or 30, rookie or veteran. We all carried that same look in our eyes, that dull, distant stare of men who'd seen too much and still had to keep moving. The airfield no longer smelled like home or safety. It smelled like ghosts. You'd walk past the line of fortresses and see the names painted on their noses. Lucky Lady, Heaven Sent, Miss Liberty, half of them blackened and broken, waiting to be scrapped for parts. The new crews that arrived tried to hide their nerves, grinning like they belonged, but we saw the fear in their faces. They were us, just a few months too late to believe in anything. Some of them asked questions about what it was like up. I told them the truth, though I shouldn't have. I said it was beautiful and terrible at the same time, that the sky could make you feel infinite, right before it reminded you how small you were. One morning, the colonel came down to the tarmac with orders that didn't sound real. Intelligence said a major Japanese convoy was regrouping near the coast, possibly an attempt to reinforce the islands further north. We were to intercept, same as before. I looked at the crew, and no one said a word. It wasn't bravery, just exhaustion. We'd lost the ability to question anything. When the engines started, that familiar vibration filled the air again. But this time, it sounded different, heavier, strained, like even the machines were tired. The pilot, Captain Reed, glanced back at us before takeoff. He didn't have to say anything. His eyes told us everything. This mission was going to be hell. The climb was rough. Storms had rolled in from the east, thick grey walls of cloud that made the horizon vanish. The inside of the fortress rattled, water dripping from the seams, lightning flashing somewhere far off. The radio buzzed with static, and the smell of damp metal filled the cabin. I could barely see through the turret glass, but every so often, the clouds broke open and I caught glimpses of the ocean below, endless, black, and waiting. We flew blind for nearly an hour before the sky cleared, and what we saw ahead of us turned my stomach cold. The Japanese fleet was larger than anything we'd faced before. Carriers, cruisers, destroyers, all moving in perfect formation, their decks lined with planes ready to launch. It looked like an entire city floating on the sea. The colonel's voice came over the radio, calm and steady. "Stay tight. We go in together." The formation tightened, and the bomb bay doors opened. The first wave dropped, and the world below erupted. Ships burst apart, decks splintered, plumes of smoke climbing into the clouds. Anti-aircraft fire answered, black bursts surrounding us like exploding ink. The fortress jolted with each near miss, the metal groaning. I squeezed the trigger, sending tracers down toward the enemy fighters rising to meet us. The sky filled with them, dozens of Zeros climbing fast, their wings flashing silver. One came straight at us, guns blazing, and I fired until the barrel smoked. I saw pieces of his wing tear off, saw the plane twist, spiral, and vanish into the flames below. There was no time to think. Another came, then another. The air around us was alive with fire and screaming engines. Then came the hit. A burst tore through the right side of the fuselage, ripping the gun mount from its frame. The shock threw me backward. I hit the floor hard, gasping for breath, the world spinning. Smoke filled the cabin, thick and black. The waist gunner dragged me up, shouting something I couldn't hear. I looked down and saw the blood on my sleeve, didn't even know it was mine. The pilot's voice broke through the chaos. "We've lost hydraulics. Hold on." The plane was shaking apart, every bolt rattling, every joint screaming. Another shell exploded near the tail, and the light outside turned orange. We were flying through hell itself, but somehow, Reed kept her level. I crawled back to the gun, wiped the blood from my eyes, and saw the ocean below littered with burning ships. It was a sight both glorious and sickening. One of our bombs had hit a carrier dead center, splitting it in half. I should have felt proud, maybe even relieved, but all I felt was empty. The water was on fire, men jumping into the waves, some trying to swim, others just floating face down. For a moment, the entire sea looked alive, moving with fire and bodies. It didn't feel like victory anymore. It felt like punishment. When we turned for home, 2 of our engines were gone. The fortress was limping, leaving a trail of smoke that stretched across the sky. Reed's voice came soft, like he was talking to the plane itself. "Come on, sweetheart. Don't give up on me now." Somehow she didn't. She just kept flying, broken wings and all. The radio was dead, the compass gone, but the navigator found his way by the stars. We drifted through the night like ghosts, the engine's rhythm slowing with every mile. Nobody spoke. We just listened to that sound, the last heartbeat of the machine that was keeping us alive. We made it back just before dawn. The landing was rough, the wheels scraping the dirt, the fuselage collapsing on one side. When the engines finally died, I realized I couldn't move. My body was shaking uncontrollably. The others climbed out one by one, some limping, some carrying the wounded. Reed stayed in the cockpit for a while, his hands still on the yoke, staring straight ahead. When he finally stood, his face was pale, streaked with sweat and smoke. He walked past us without a word, like a man leaving a grave. Later, after the medics finished with me, I walked back to what was left of the fortress. Her skin was shredded, her nose torn open, one wing barely attached, but she'd made it home. I pressed my hand against the metal, still warm from the flight, and whispered, "You did it." Maybe that was the last bit of faith I had left. Not in God, not in country, but in that machine that refused to die. If you've ever felt like the only thing keeping you standing was held together by rust and willpower, I want you to tell me in the comments, I'm still flying. By that point, time had lost its edges. Days bled into nights, and nights bled into dreams that never stayed gone when you woke. The war wasn't somewhere far away anymore. It was inside you, a constant hum beneath the ribs. I remember sitting by the wreckage of the fortress we'd brought home, running my fingers over the bullet holes like they were scars on living skin. The mechanics said she'd never fly again, that she'd given all she could. I didn't argue. I just nodded, lit a cigarette, and watched the smoke curl up into the sky like another ghost leaving us. The next morning, they rolled a new one out, shiny and clean. No history in her metal. We painted the same name on her nose, Pete's Lady, because somehow it felt wrong to let that name die with him. Every mission after that, it was like he was still there, watching our backs. Maybe he was. Maybe we all carried someone with us up there. The new fortress had a different sound to her engines, sharper, less forgiving. It took a while to learn her rhythm. We flew runs along the coast, hitting supply depots, airfields, convoys. Sometimes we came back untouched. Sometimes we didn't come back at all. You learned not to count how many fortresses took off, or how many landed. The math was always cruel. Reed kept flying like a man who'd made peace with death. He'd hum under his breath sometimes during the climb, low and steady, some tune I never recognized. I think it kept him sane. For me, it was the letters from home that kept me tethered. My mother still wrote, though her words had changed. She didn't ask if I was eating or sleeping anymore. She just wrote about hope, about light, about the garden blooming again in spring. I'd read her letters up in the turret before missions, fold them neatly, and slide them into my jacket pocket like armor. One evening, after a long sortie that left half the squadron missing, I sat alone in the mess hall. The air smelled like sweat and diesel, the lights dim, the walls covered in shadows that looked like movement. A new kid sat down across from me. He couldn't have been more than 19. He asked me if it ever got easier. I told him the truth. It didn't. You just got better at pretending it did. He didn't know what to say after that. He finished his coffee, nodded, and walked out. I never saw him again after the next mission. I didn't even learn his last name. That's how the war took people from you, quietly, without ceremony. Weeks later, Command ordered a major strike on enemy installations deep inland. It was going to be our longest flight yet, 10 hours round trip, over heavy defenses. The night before, I couldn't sleep. I lay there listening to the jungle outside, insects buzzing, the ocean whispering beyond the trees. I thought about home, about what it would feel like to walk down Main Street, to smell rain on pavement, to sit on the porch with my father like I used to. It felt so far away, it might as well have been another planet. Somewhere between exhaustion and prayer, I promised myself that if I made it through that mission, I'd never take the sky again. We took off before dawn, the air thick and heavy, the engines glowing like angry suns. The formation climbed through a blanket of fog, the first light painting everything gold. It might have been beautiful if it weren't for the dread sitting in my gut. The first hour was smooth, the second, not so much. Flak found us early, black clouds blooming around the formation, the sound like giants slamming hammers against the hull. The fortress shook with every blast. Reed's voice came through steady. "Hold tight, boys. We're almost there." You could hear the strain in it, the fatigue that never left his tone anymore. The bombardier started calling targets, his voice clipped, precise. When the bay doors opened, the cold air rushed in, sharp as knives. The bombs fell like pieces of our souls. The explosions below rolled through the clouds, light flashing like lightning beneath us. For a few seconds, everything went quiet. Then the fighters came, Zeros again, dozens of them. They swarmed from above and behind, filling the sky with streaks of silver and flame. I gripped the handles of the gun, the vibrations rattling my bones as I fired into the chaos. I saw one plane break apart under the tracers, another dive into the sea, but there were too many. One bullet tore through the glass near my face, spraying shards across my cheek. The blood felt warm, sticky. I kept shooting. Reed yelled that the right engine was gone. Smoke poured through the fuselage, filling our lungs. The fortress started to lose altitude, but we didn't break formation. Not yet. Not until the job was done. That's what Reed always said. By some miracle, we made it through. Half the formation didn't. We landed with one engine dead, fuel leaking, and the tail barely holding. When we stopped, nobody cheered. Nobody said a word. We just sat there in the silence, listening to the ticking of the cooling metal. The ground crew climbed in, wide-eyed, asking how we'd made it back. None of us had an answer. Reed climbed out last. He looked at the sky for a long time, then said softly, "No more missions for me." He wasn't asking. He walked away without turning back. 2 days later, they shipped him stateside with a medical discharge. I never saw him again. That night, I walked to the edge of the airstrip and stared at the horizon. The sky was clear, the stars sharp and cold. Somewhere out there, men were still fighting, still falling, still trying to make sense of the madness. I lit a cigarette, breathed in the smoke, and thought about how strange it was that something so deadly could look so peaceful from far away. War teaches you that distance lies. It hides the smell, the screams, the faces. Up close, it's all too real. I looked down at the ground beneath my boots, at the oil stains and the dirt, and realized that even if I went home, the war was coming with me. It had already taken root inside me. If you've ever looked back at something that changed you forever and realized you'd never be the same, write it below. The war never really ended. It's been years since that last flight, but some nights I still wake up to the sound of engines in the dark. The hum is so real that I half expect to feel the vibration under my feet, the rush of cold air through the open bay doors, the smell of oil and smoke filling my lungs. Then the silence comes, thick and absolute, and I remember where I am, not in the sky, not over the Pacific, but in a quiet little town far from everything we fought for. They said the war was over, that we could all go home and start again. But the truth is, home was never the same place after we left it. You can't come back from that kind of sky and pretend the ground feels right beneath you. People talk about peace, like it's something you can hold, but I've never felt it. What I have instead is memory, heavy, alive, unshakable. When I first stepped off the train, there was a band playing and flags waving. People smiling like we'd done something grand. My mother cried when she saw me, though I think part of her was crying for the boy who never came back, the one who left in uniform and returned as a stranger. My father just shook my hand and said, "You did your part, son," but I didn't know what that meant anymore. At night, when the house went quiet, I'd hear the old floorboards creak and think it was the plane shifting in turbulence. I'd reach for the turret handles that weren't there, my fingers curling around ghosts. The letters from my mother stopped mentioning the garden. She knew better now. There were some things even flowers couldn't cover. I tried working again. Small factory job, steady hours, predictable, but the sound of the machine set my nerves on fire. Every metallic bang was flak, every hiss of steam a warning siren. The other men didn't understand why I'd flinch, why I'd stare at the ceiling when the whistles blew. I kept Pete's coin in my pocket, always. Some nights I'd take it out, roll it between my fingers, and tell myself he'd have liked this life, quiet and slow. Maybe he would have, maybe not. There were others like me at the bar, guys from the 8th Air Force, from the islands, from Europe. We didn't talk about battles or medals. We just sat there, drinking, nodding, carrying that same silence between us. A kind of understanding words could never touch. The first time I visited a reunion, decades later, the hangar was filled with grey hair and worn faces. Someone had restored an old B-17, polished and perfect, sitting under the lights like a monument. I ran my hand along the metal, smooth and cold, and for a second I saw it all again. The guns shaking, the sky burning, the ocean swallowing flame. The ghosts were there too, just out of sight. We spoke their names softly, each one like a prayer. A younger man, a historian maybe, asked me what it felt like back then, flying those missions. I thought for a long time before I answered. It felt, I said, like living on borrowed time, like every breath belonged to someone who didn't make it. He nodded, but I could tell he didn't really understand. How could he? You had to be there, feel the air tear around you, see a friend vanish into the clouds, to know what it truly meant to survive. I go to the coast sometimes, stand by the water and watch the waves roll in. The sea looks the same as it did back then, calm and cruel. I close my eyes and listen to the wind, and sometimes I swear I can hear them. The engines, the voices, the laughter we shared between the fear. Maybe that's what eternity sounds like, a sky full of echoes that never fade. I still dream of flying though, not of war, not of the chaos, just of the sky itself, the weightless silence before the sun breaks through the clouds, the feeling of belonging somewhere vast and endless. Maybe that's what keeps me from breaking completely. The sky took so much from us, but it also gave us something we could never find on the ground, the certainty that even when everything burns, you can still rise. So that's the story, or what's left of it. The missions, the fire, the faces, they all live somewhere inside me, stitched into the quiet between heartbeats. People ask if I'd do it again, knowing what I know now. I think about Pete's laugh, Reed's steady hands, the sound of the engines as we climbed into the unknown, and I tell them yes, because in that fire and chaos, I learned what it meant to hold on when everything else was falling apart. I learned what it meant to be part of something bigger than fear, and maybe, after all this time, that's enough. If you've walked through your own kind of war and come out carrying pieces of it, give this story a like and hit subscribe. Not for me, but for everyone who's still learning how to fly again.